As of 2026, game prices have become somewhat unpredictable. With prices rising in almost every regard, video games were eventually going to be affected. The reality is that we went from having one of the most volatile price strategies at the start to finally having some stability. What I would like to ask is, where did it all go wrong? Why are prices rising and companies becoming far more comfortable with the idea of raising prices until gamers draw the line? To answer this question, I present to you the history of game prices, the truth of the matter. Now, to understand what has happened when it comes to video game prices in 2026, we need to take a look back at what prices used to be like in the earlier years, when people first didn't need to rely on arcade machines in order to play a video game, and were able to just bring their systems home with them, with the Magnavox Odyssey, the very first home console. Not many people really think about this system nowadays, but it was the very first break that was needed, even if it was incredibly simple by today's standards. This system also introduced the notion of swappable game modules, allowing users to purchase games for it instead of just playing a single game on any given machine. This particular system did come with multiple games included, but you could purchase more games for about $5.1972 money, which is roughly about $30.23 in today's economy. But these game cards were mostly just keys that would activate the games already built into the system, and came with different backgrounds. Though gaming was still a pretty niche industry and gaming at home was even less common, so the barrier to entry had to be pretty low. Then fast forward a few years. During the second generation, the Magnavox Odyssey 2 entered the scene and also had game cards that you could purchase. But at this point, until the late 70s and early 80s, these games were typically sold for around $20 to $30. Some games were more premium, but home console gaming was a little bit more popular at this point. The Atari 2600 games had a similar price point for its games, usually reaching up to $40 for some games, but the average price was around $24, which is about $72.55 in today's money. Now, during the third generation console race, the NES pushed prices further up to $50. And as many know, Nintendo tried very hard to make sure that these prices stayed high no matter what stores these games were sold in. Prices were higher because Nintendo charged a lot of money to publishers and developers in order to source their cartridges to them, which typically ranged from anywhere between $10 up to even $20 per blank cartridge, while competitors like Sega and Atari sold their cartridges to publishers for up to $12. And Nintendo's most expensive games at this time were sold at roughly $50 at the time, which is equivalent to about $151 in today's money. Now, during the fourth generation of gaming, cartridges reached a high point of about $70 for the most expensive games, now some of which would be found on either the Sega Genesis or the Super Nintendo. Now, games were always expensive and definitely a big risk for publishers, developers, manufacturers, and especially the consumer, but this model was still sustainable for those who wanted to game because of how popular game rentals were at the time, and the used market was incredibly strong too. Now, this fact was true all throughout the 90s. With widespread use of a much cheaper medium, video games didn't have to be as expensive. CDs made that possible, as cartridges were expensive to produce, and even to just buy as a publisher, CDs were considerably cheaper, as publishers only paid about $3 per disc and could hold much more data than a typical cartridge, so they became far more popular even if loading times were worse. The fifth generation was when a lot of games reached a standard $50 price tag, but that still depended on the publisher and platform that these games were sold on, as well as how many discs they needed to include for a single game. Things remained pretty much the same during the sixth generation console race, but DVDs became the standard this generation, as they could hold up to 4.7 gigabytes of data on a single layer disc. In the early 2000s, DVD-based discs would sell for around $50, which is about $86 in today's money. And the disc-based technology allowed these games to become cheaper, and as time went on, everyone got used to paying about the same amount for brand new games. The used market was still a powerful tool for those who wanted to pay less. However, prices would finally reach a ceiling in 2005 with the start of the seventh generation of gaming, a ceiling that not many would dare to break for a very long time. With With the launch of the Xbox 360 in 2005, AAA games were being sold for $60 the vast majority of the time. While this was higher than the $50 to $55 price tag that a lot of games were being sold for, this price point was widely adopted. DVDs were still being used and were still very cheap, but Sony started utilizing a brand new format this generation: Blu-ray discs. A single-layer disc could hold up to 25 gigabytes of storage, which was a significant difference, and manufacturing these was barely more expensive than just manufacturing a DVD, costing just a few more cents. Only Nintendo's handhelds were still using cartridges at this time, and these held very little data compared to even just a DVD. But games for it were sold usually at a max of $40 on something like the Nintendo DS. The industry had embraced disc media almost entirely by now, thanks to the Wii finally caving and using proprietary discs that were basically just DVDs, while the Xbox 360 either used multiple DVD discs for games that were just too big, or a two-layer DVD disc, or even in Sony's case, they just stuck with Blu-ray for their games. Now this generation, publishers started to embrace digital distribution of games directly to their systems, which would eliminate the need to pay for shelf space, a physical disc, a case, a manual, and whatever other trinkets would come with a physical game. The prices for AAA video games stayed at a very consistent $60, and the only way that it wouldn't be the case was if you happened to purchase a special edition with more trinkets and accessories, or if the game was just priced lower from the start. The price was consistent all the way up until the near end of the 8th generation console race, which was a very long time. But publishers, unfortunately, didn't just accept the $60 model, as it was because they found many creative ways of gaining the system as it were. During the 7th gen, paid DLC became a concept that the vast majority of publishers explored to try and get gamers to pay them a little bit more for game content. One of the many instances of paid DLC that broke the internet was the sale of Horse Armor and The Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion, which they sold for $5. This was just one instance, and inherently, there isn't anything wrong with the idea of downloadable content. This gave publishers and developers the opportunity to continue creating content for games that they had already released, which is a wonderful way of supporting a game even further. Most story-related DLC were priced at around $20, but this practice became an unfortunate trend when it came to purposefully splitting up content from games to sell them back to you again later. Some publishers would sell most of the game for $60, then sell the other part for an extra $20 and beyond as extra story content. Additionally, publishers proposed that games could be even cheaper if they were sold through a digital storefront, but they kept prices exactly the same across the board, which meant that digital games were just the more profitable variant. These savings were not passed on to us, and the idea of finishing a game after it had already been released while selling you this missing content was a practice that became all too common. By the end of the 8th generation console race, publishers became far too comfortable even buying the lowest capacity disc to save money, then have you download the rest of the game either off of the internet or the disc itself onto your system. And there were just many workarounds that at the end of it all just made it much more profitable for publishers to continue with these practices and just more expensive for the gamer over time. And this was during an era where gaming was at the biggest that it had ever been at that point, and it was only growing in spite of everything that I've mentioned so far. Even then, no one dared to raise the $60 base ceiling until EA gave it a shot. They were the first publisher to sell the base version of a video game for $70, that being NBA 2K21, just citing the rising cost of development as the reason why. This was the game to open the floodgates, and nearly every AAA games publisher has raised their prices to a minimum of $70. Mind you, at this point, publishers are selling many different types of cosmetics as well, and in many cases, these can cost between $10 and $20. This is the case for many different AAA games, and the industry continues to lean in that direction much more aggressively as time progresses. What this means is that the price tag increase happened during a time where publishers had very diverse methods of making money off of you during what was easily one of the most profitable time periods in gaming. As of today, things have only gotten worse, and we've approached an era of far too much uncertainty. Now here's going to be the thing about all of the video game prices that I've mentioned so far. Video games have gotten cheaper when compared to the prices that we saw in the 80s and especially the 90s, where games were very expensive. But the difference is that wages have not grown at nearly the same pace as inflation has, which means that even though an N64 cartridge that may have been sold for roughly $70 at the time or $141 in today's money is more expensive than Mario Kart World at $80 in today's money. You probably don't make enough for this to be a purchase that you can just make on a whim. It's just that nowadays we are much more willing to overpay for these video games than we were a decade ago because gaming has become that mainstream. We all want to be a part of this hobby still. AAA publishers still make a lot of money, as consistently reported by many outlets, while still pursuing cost-cutting measures moving forward. Now, these include spending as little money as possible at manufacturing this physical media, emphasizing digital storefronts, laying off developers, and shutting down game studios. As of now, major studios have been shut down, which include Blue Point Games, a shutdown that shocked everyone considering the overall quality of games that they've produced. But this is just one of many, and prices are only going up. With the recent release of the Nintendo Switch 2, Nintendo announced terrible pricing, which essentially just means that they price most re-releases of games at $70 and that they will try to push for more $80 games. The standard price for video games is still at $70, but many believe that more publishers will become much more comfortable charging higher prices, such as $100 for GTA 6, but that's still just speculation at this time, even if it is a valid concern. But it's not just the price of video games that have gone up, as even hardware has increased in price significantly thanks to the RAM shortage and tariffs. I know some gamers were still buying hardware at inflated prices once companies increased them, which can send out the message that gamers are still willing to pay higher prices, which could very well lead prices only staying high once things technically normalize. When games are released at significantly lower prices, like at $50 with games like Expedition 33 and Oblivion Remastered, it is something worth celebrating, as we aren't really used to getting this kind of quality for that price anymore. But games like these are obviously not very commonly made, and the used market does exist for current generation games, but it's not as big as it was for previous gens, as a lot of people have shifted to just buying games online. Now, publishers have shifted to focusing mostly on digital sales. The used market when it comes to current generation games isn't really that interesting. Not to mention that new game releases have not been nearly as frequent as we had seen even just the generation prior. Now, the used market is mostly focused on selling retro games right now, as many have felt nostalgic for games that didn't really suffer from a lot of the problems that many new games have to deal with nowadays. And as of now, the only certainty in all of this craziness is that prices are probably only going to keep increasing, and no matter how much backlash the publishers receive, they still persist with the exact same practices. As of 2026, buying games is still expensive. Now, gaming in general has always been an expensive hobby, and while it technically has gotten cheaper to be a gamer in this current year, it comes with so much baggage of having so many missing pieces to any gaming experience locked behind multiple paywalls. We all miss the days of $60 games, as that was a price that we had all gotten used to, and it was reliably in place for so long. And while there was a lot of uncertainty in the earlier decades regarding pricing, we were able to escape that until now, where it seems to be making a return, one that really isn't very welcome. I wanted to dive into the history of video games prices in order to examine if being a gamer is more expensive now than it was before, and the answer is complicated. In raw dollars, it is cheaper, but in terms of what value is offered from these experiences and the fact that prices are ever increasing in one way or another, it's pretty tough to say that it is genuinely cheaper than ever before, because it surely does not really feel that way at all. Now, soon enough, I will be making a video about how handheld systems have evolved, as it is quite interesting to see the way that they've changed since the 70s. And if you're interested in watching this video when it comes out, then please make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss that mini documentary when it comes out. Now, thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries, and do consider pressing the hype button on this video in order to boost it in the algorithm, and sharing it also helps out a ton. Until next time.